You'll see from the handout that I ended up producing a slightly different paper than I originally proposed. I realized halfway through last week that the paper I was planning to do was far too ambitious, so I decided to really drill down on what is probably one of the more provocative parts, or perhaps crazier parts of the paper that I was going to present. And so there are more questions that I had planned to address, and maybe these will come up in the discussion time, but I wanted to slightly narrow the focus to thinking about the question of why is it that the knowledge of good and evil is seen to be at the very center of what it means to be a fallen creature, at least according to the Genesis narrative. Okay, so at various points in Scripture, sin is rooted in humans prioritizing their own narratives over against God's narrative. To be a sinner is to become someone who refuses to embrace who they are as a character in God's narrative and instead ground their meaning and morality in their own stories over against God's narrative. In doing so, sin is presented as a way of denying the meaning and morality intrinsic to the created being of humans, in favor of immersing themselves in their own fictions and fantasies. So to present a case for this view of sin, I'm going to offer a theological reading of the origin story of sin, the Genesis story of the fall, as the story of humans falling away from God's narrative into their own narrative constructions. More specifically, in conversation with Dietrich Bonhoeffer, I shall propose that the disobedient act of eating from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil represents the human resolve to prioritize their own narratives over against God's narrative. To do so, I'm going to begin with a brief note on the genre of this story. I'll then discuss what the two trees in the Genesis story represent. In short, I'll contend that the tree of life reveals the Garden of Eden to be a place where the fullness of life and flourishing is defined by God's narrative. The tree of the knowledge of good and evil, by contrast, reveals the deathly possibility of humans rejecting God's authority or authoriality in favor of prioritizing their own authority or authoriality. And then in the final section, I'll briefly consider why it might have been loving for God to prohibit Adam and Eve from gaining the knowledge of good and evil. And then I'll then conclude by considering what the narrative of the fall might have to tell us about how we should approach the problem of evil. So first, how did Bonhoeffer understand the genre of the narrative of the fall? So for Bonhoeffer, this story represents an origin story that applies to each one of us. It tells us something true about the history of every human life in this world. But Bonhoeffer does not for a moment think this story provides a record of actual events that took place at the very beginning of human history. So while this story does speak to our lives in this world, it does not do so in the way that an historical record might do so. Rather, it offers a poetic representation of a pivotal chapter in the story of our lives before God. So for Bonhoeffer, in the story of the fall, we remain wholly in the world of pictures, in the world of the magical. And yet, the story of the fall also represents actual goings-on in our history. It represents fundamental truths about what has gone wrong, and indeed what is going wrong with human life in this world. So, and I say a bit more about this in the handout, or let's have another quote from Bonhoeffer where he says a bit more. So, what is it that this story represents? To understand what I and Bonhoeffer take to be the central message of the story of the fall, let us turn our attention now to the two trees in the garden. For Bonhoeffer, the story of the fall tells us that the destiny of humankind is to be decided in relation to these two trees. So first, what does the tree of life tell us about the Garden of Eden? So by planting the tree of life to grow in the midst of the garden, God gives the garden a center, a heart that signifies the life that God breathes into the garden. Bonhoeffer writes, "The life that comes from God is at the center. That is to say, God who gives life is at the center. At the center of the world that has been put at Adam's disposal and over which Adam has been given dominion is not Adam himself, but the tree of divine life. Adam's life comes from the center, which is not Adam, but God. It revolves around the center constantly, without ever trying to take possession of the center of existence. So this tree of life at the center of the garden reveals the garden to be a place where human flourishing revolves around the God of life, who as the author and giver of life defines what it means to be human. The tree of life reveals that the garden is not, therefore, a free space for Adam and Eve to become whatever they want to become. Rather, it is a place of belonging, defined by God's narrative, where life is found in the unity of unbroken obedience to the Creator. For Bonhoeffer, Adam has life just because Adam lives from the center of life and is oriented towards the center of life, without placing Adam's own life at the center. This tree, therefore, is a sign that Adam and Eve must look to God to learn about who they are and who they should be as characters in God's narrative. It tells them that they do not simply live because they have beating hearts and lungs to breathe, but they live meaningfully by virtue of their being characters in God's narrative. This means that Adam and Eve become orientated towards their own flourishing when their lives align with God's narrative. Now, the tree of the knowledge of good and evil has a very different purpose than the tree of life. It does not signify a viable option for Adam and Eve. Rather, as theologian Karl Barth writes, it is the warning sign of a possibility which, if realized, will necessarily be the opposite of the life and salvation that is promised. And yet, by planting this tree, God does not turn the garden into a threatening place. As Bill Arnold notes, the garden remains a place of peace and tranquility so long as Adam and Eve are willing to hear God's command to stay away from a single tree. The garden thus continues to be a place of flourishing so long as Adam and Eve embrace their roles as characters in God's narrative. Nonetheless, the presence of the two trees do place Adam and Eve at a crossroads. Having access to the tree of knowledge indicates that obedience to God is not inevitable, but a possibility that Adam and Eve must willfully embrace. And this crossroads prefigures the crossroads that are constantly being faced by the people of Israel. As Hebrew Bible scholar Nathan MacDonald points out, for both Adam and the people of Israel, continued existence in the land depends on obedience to the divine law. The presence of the two trees in the garden prefigures the alternative possibilities of Israel's existence. On the one hand, life through the law and the tabernacle. On the other, destruction and ruin. This is the mark of its election. Now, to extend this point further, I think the story of the two trees can be read as a story of the ultimate crossroads, the ultimate either-or that faces each of us in this world. Either to embrace God's narrative or to deny it. Either to see ourselves as characters in God's narrative or to see God as a character in our own narratives, making us the gods of meaning. However, while God may allow us these two possibilities, this does not mean that God respects our decision, whatever we should so decide. God determines that embracing God's narrative leads to life and flourishing, whereas rejecting it in favor of our own narratives entails death and destruction. So why is it that God cares what humans decide? For Bonhoeffer, it is because God creates humans to have life in a particular way. God does not create us to live by a spontaneous freedom given over to limitless narrative possibilities, but again, to live according to God's narrative. And for Bonhoeffer, this means that true human freedom must be understood as a freedom in limitation, a freedom defined and limited by God's narrative. Now, this account of human freedom is by no means novel and can be found throughout the history of the Abrahamic traditions. Yet, while it may be common, the notion that true human freedom is grounded in God's judgment rather than human judgment is not at all easy to comprehend. This is because in our experience of this world, we are accustomed to prioritizing our own judgment, to judging others, and to defining others as characters in our own narratives. Indeed, we have become so conditioned into thinking in this way that we find it difficult to imagine how we could ever allow the judgment of another, even God, to take priority in our lives. Or perhaps we wonder why we would ever want someone to have such authority. Our autonomy and our capacity to judge others according to our own narratives is assumed to be essential to human freedom. Now, to be completely clear, Bonhoeffer does not rule this out altogether. While there may be limited ways in which we can experience the flourishing for which God creates us, God does allow us some room to make our own judgments, but only according to sub-narratives that must ultimately track with God's overarching narrative. But again, there are still theological problems as to why human autonomy can become a problem. While there are certainly going to be times when we need to make judgments for ourselves about the legitimacy of human authorities, for Bonhoeffer, there is never a time when we have the authority to judge the legitimacy of God's authority, assuming, of course, that we can know with confidence that we really are confronted with God's authority. Because if God is the ultimate grounding authority, the one according to whom all other authority is measured, then God's authority is always legitimate. There is no higher authority according to which the legitimacy of God's authority can be questioned. This means that God's judgment can never truly be subject to human judgment. So if, therefore, human judgment leads us to question God's judgment, this will be due to a confusion on our part. It is misguided to think that we can judge the validity of God's judgment according to our own narratives. Once again, to judge God in this way would be to treat God as a character in a human story, as one over whom we possess a higher authority. To connect this to the narrative of the fall, such judgment would involve judging God on the basis of our own knowledge of good and evil. Now, before I say more about the nature of the fall into the knowledge of good and evil, I think it might be helpful to say something about how we might conceive of unfallen human life, life before the fall. So, describing Adam's knowledge prior to eating from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, Bonhoeffer writes, Adam cannot know evil, cannot conceive it, and cannot know or conceive death either. But Adam knows the limits of human beings because Adam knows God. So therefore, Adam understands the limits of human life not according to his own moral judgment, with which he limits himself to what he deems good rather than evil, and not according to his own physical judgment, with which he limits himself to what he deems physically life-giving rather than fatal. But he primarily lives according to God's judgment, with which his life is limited according to what God tells him. So Adam obeys God simply because he knows and experiences God as the one who defines the boundaries of his existence. What this points to is a form of theological semantic externalism, according to which true meaning has its source in God, who is external to Adam's internal thought processes. I'll say a bit more about this on the handout. So the nature of human flourishing, and importantly, the reference of the language that articulates it, is defined again by God's narrative rather than Adam's. So what happens when Adam and Eve disobey God by eating from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil? For Bonhoeffer, they gain a form of moral autonomy according to which they come to construe good and evil in their own terms, apart from, and indeed in resistance to God's guiding judgment. Now, the problem with their taking this knowledge to themselves is that, unlike God, Adam and Eve are not essentially good in and of themselves. This means that when the knowledge of good and evil becomes grounded in themselves, it ceases to be grounded in what is truly and essentially good. Instead, it takes on a life of its own, warped by Adam's and Eve's own arbitrary constructions of meaning. To draw on Isaiah 5:19 through 20, when they try to live according to these constructions without a firm grounding in God's holy plan, they fall into confusion, calling good what is objectively evil, and calling evil what is objectively good. Now, the question might arise here as to why God could not at least grant humans some autonomy to make up their own minds about what is good and evil. Why could God not let us be co-equal authors when it comes to constructing meaning and morality? So the answer to this is quite simply that there cannot be a co-equal author of creation, and its ultimate narrative which determines what is good and evil. If God is truly before all created things and purposefully brings all created things into existence out of nothing, God can never be less than the ground of all meaning. When God purposefully and intentionally creates the world, everything emerges with an inescapable meaning. But again, while God may determine the meaning of all things, it is also the case, as we see in the narrative of the fall, that God places us at a crossroads, where we have the option to try to construct our own meaning in our lives. Just as parents may allow their children to play make-believe, so also God allows us to construct our own fictions and live into them. However, there's an important qualification to make here. While it may benefit children to pretend to be something other than they are, it never benefits humans to pretend to be other than who God creates them to be. I qualify this a bit further in the handout. For Bonhoeffer, such godless imagining is always delusional. It always involves an attempt to reimagine creation according to our own narratives, and thereby to try to become like God in a way that serves to displace God as the ultimate author. It is because God defines all creation that humans can only find fulfillment according to God's narrative. Put simply, there just is no competing narrative that can truly give us an alternative way to live and flourish. So we have no option but to accept and respond to God's characterization of us, regardless of our own views on the matter. We have no autonomy to question God's narrative according to our own narratives. And whenever we pretend that we can do this, as Augustine puts it, humanity turns with its back to God. In so doing, Bonhoeffer writes, humanity sits in judgment on God's word instead of simply listening to it and doing it. When this happens, Bonhoeffer elaborates, and this is quoted on the handout, humans believe on the basis of an idea, a principle, or some prior knowledge of God, and then pass judgment on the concrete word of God. But where human beings use a principle, an idea of God, as a weapon to fight against the concrete word of God, there they are from the outset already in the right. At that point, they have become God's master. They have left the path of obedience. They have withdrawn from being addressed by God. In other words, in the questioning of God, what is possible is played off against reality. And what is possible undermines what is reality. In the relation of human beings to God, however, there are no possibilities. There is only reality. There is no let me first. There is only commandment and obedience. So for Bonhoeffer, because God creates humans to participate in such a perfect union, such an intimate relationship with God, there is no space whatsoever for us to try to judge things on our own terms, according to our own narratives, over against God. Before God, we must come to know and interpret ourselves as the characters we are in God's narrative. So to summarize, it is on the basis of God's commitment to defining human life and flourishing and to securing that life and flourishing that God prohibits Adam and Eve from eating from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. This prohibition of knowledge, therefore, is an act of love. Now, I realize that the idea of prohibiting knowledge can be seen as an act of love is going to be a provocative idea. So I'm going to now just briefly elaborate on the theological reasoning behind this contention. So, why might prohibiting knowledge not only be reasonable, but also at times a profoundly loving act? Now, one of the first examples that may come to mind when thinking about forbidden knowledge is the way that we prohibit children from developing a knowledge of certain things at a certain age, such as an experiential knowledge of drugs, alcohol, sex, violence, or gambling. This is because we recognize children are not yet able to make appropriate judgments about how to process and employ such knowledge. However, we are much slower to prohibit adults from cultivating such experiential knowledge, even though adults also struggle to process and employ such knowledge well. And the cultivation of adults' knowledge in this respect is constantly has a harmful impact on society. Now, among the reasons for this different approach to adults is the perception that, at a certain age, human autonomy should be less constrained and persons should be more free to know things and make their own judgments about how to employ such knowledge. Nonetheless, there are still times, I think, when we think it is appropriate to prohibit adults from knowing things under certain circumstances. So, for example, it can be a crime to leak classified information. There will be times when we don't think it's opportune to share information with someone. So, for example, where two pilots trying to stop a plane from crashing, that would seem like a bad time for one pilot to confess to be having an affair with their co-pilot's partner. Also, sometimes people themselves want to forbid forms of knowledge from being communicated to them. For example, when they are resistant to hearing spoilers about a film or a book. Now, the reason for prohibiting knowledge in these kinds of situations is that the appropriation of such knowledge is likely to be harmful to the recipient of that knowledge and/or to others who could be harmed as a result of a particular person receiving that knowledge. Now, while it wouldn't be difficult to come up with a number of other examples of instances when it might be appropriate to prohibit knowledge, I think generally such examples are going to be seen to be exceptional. Again, I think there's a general reluctance to think of some forms of knowledge as being totally off limits, that there is some kind of epistemic frontier that should forever remain uncharted. And such resistance is especially evident in the university. While it is true that some forms of research are forbidden, the notion that certain forms of knowledge should be forbidden will often be seen as an affront to academic freedom, to the free and open inquiry that is so important to human innovation. As James Flynn writes, censorship of a viewpoint is to claim a prescriptive infallibility, as if you were an omnipotent God Emperor decreeing that something never be heard or weighed by others for the remainder of human history. So one of the reasons I think that we might be resistant to the notion of censorship and forbidden knowledge is an underlying assumption that knowledge itself is never a problem. That knowledge of abstract truths is not itself dangerous. Knowledge only becomes a problem when persons misappropriate it and use it in a way that is dysfunctional. The problem with this view of knowledge is that it neglects the fact that we are not straightforwardly free to relate to knowledge abstractly in a neutral way. An experiential knowledge of drugs, alcohol, or gambling may drive people into addiction. Pornographic knowledge inevitably leads to the objectification of persons. Knowledge that one's co-pilot is having an affair with one's partner may lead a plane to crash. So there are endless examples of persons being negatively impacted by knowledge in a way that seems unavoidable. And again, it shouldn't be too difficult for us to think of instances when it might have been better off for us ourselves not to learn something. A common example of this could be gossip. I think most people will be able to think of a time when they learned a piece of gossip and found themselves spreading that gossip. Now, if we assume that gossiping is wrong, then it is rational to think that it would be better for people not to hear the relevant information. That is why some people, when offered the chance to learn a piece of gossip, will respond by saying, "I don't want to know." So the basic point that I'm trying to communicate here is that the acquisition of certain forms of knowledge or knowing can itself be corrupting. So why is it that we are not better proprietors of knowledge? Why can we not have more control over how we appropriate knowledge? So the theological answer to these questions is that we have turned away from the truth, from the divine source of meaning, and thereby fallen into a state of sinful confusion, where we are pushed around by our disordered desires. But even for those who reject the theological response, but are still moral realists, they should still be able to recognize that there are many ways in which we seem to be unreliable judges of good and evil. I list some evidence for this on the handout. Okay, so given the disordered and capricious status of human judgment, let us consider the following questions. If we had the option to live our lives according to a moral compass that was both reliable and righteous, in a way that our current compasses are not, would we pass up this opportunity? Or, to reframe the question, if we were living our lives according to a moral compass that was reliable and righteous, would this be something we would want to risk losing? And if we lived in such a heavenly state of morality, would it not make sense to forbid the possibility of our falling into a state of existence characterized by moral failure, where we came to experience all the horrors that we know to emerge in such a state? Or, to reframe the question once more, if there were a pill that would lead a child to form the judgment of a psychopath, would we not want to prohibit them from taking it? What these questions invite is recognition that there may be understandable reasons for God to prohibit us from falling into our own autonomous ways of knowing, given the destruction that such ways of knowing entail, over against living lives that are defined first and foremost by God's authority. One of the things that should, I think, be unambiguously clear to all of us from observing the world is, as Nicholas Rescher notes, there may be some sorts of knowledge that people just cannot handle, destabilizing them to the point where the knowledge destroys or undermines their ability to function effectively. So in this brief discussion of forbidden knowledge, my aim here is simply to consider some understandable reasons why God might forbid us from forming a moral autonomy in the light of which we prioritize our own moral judgment over against God's judgment. To reframe my earlier quote from James Flynn, there are understandable reasons why God would act as an omnipotent God-emperor, decreeing that something never be heard or weighed by others for the remainder of human history. Now, before I conclude, there's something I should clarify. So much of what I have just said could appear to be much more apologetic than it has the right to be. In some of what I have just said, I have offered an argument as to why it might be valid for God to forbid the knowledge of good and evil. In so doing, I could appear to be appealing to a shared human knowledge of good and evil, according to which we can judge whether it would be right for God to forbid humans from embracing their own knowledge of good and evil. Now, if this were my aim, I would be judging God as a character in my own moral narrative so as to defend or even justify God. Clearly, such a move would express an inconsistency in my reasoning. However, I think there's another way to interpret what I've just been doing. Rather than offering a defense of divine prohibition, my argument could be understood as offering a theological explanation for why it's loving for God to prohibit humans from attaining their own moral autonomy. What makes my explanation theological is that it seeks to represent God's narrative in as much as this is humanly possible. Now, to conclude, I would like to consider briefly how we might take a Bonhoefferian approach to the problem of evil. To frame the problem of evil in a way that connects to our discussion, let me raise the following question. If God really does create us to live according to God's narrative, then why on earth would God allow us to fall into lives that are defined by our own narratives? Or, to ask this in terms of the Genesis story, why would God provide Adam and Eve with access to the tree of the knowledge of good and evil if God intended to prohibit them from eating of it? Now, the basic, and perhaps frustrating, response to these questions is that the Genesis stories do not provide us with such an answer. But I do think there is more that we can say here. To make a very bold suggestion, we could contend that certain forms of speculation over these kinds of questions may be every bit as worthy of prohibition as the knowledge of good and evil itself. It would seem to be something of a misstep to come away from reading the Genesis story of the fall with speculative suppositions about why God does what God does, why God allows what God allows, according to our own knowledge of good and evil. As Gerard von Rad explains, nothing is said to indicate that God combined pedagogical intentions with this prohibition to eat from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. On the contrary, one destroys the essential part of the story with such rationalistic explanations. Man, in his original state, was completely subject to God's command. And the question, who will say to God, "What are you doing?" was equally out of place in paradise. So often, when we reflect on the problem of evil, our attention is drawn to the very worst of atrocities, such that evil and the problem it presents gain a certain power to agitate, distress, and haunt us. Consequently, we can easily become absorbed by the problem in a way that generates a certain admiration for it. And this can lead our immediate and often emotional experience of the problem to end up playing a fundamental role in shaping our theology. Indeed, it may even lead us to define who we think God must be, according to our own fraught understanding of the problem. Some, for example, have been led to suggest that God is limited to such an extent that God cannot help but allow evil to unfold in the way that it does. Or, the problem of evil may lead us to come up with solutions to the problem that focus on satisfying our puzzlement over the coexistence of God and evil. Perhaps, for example, solutions that point to some good, valuable enough to justify God's willingness to allow evil to emerge. Among the solutions that we might naturally come up with, we are unlikely to find a story about God establishing a covenant relationship with a particular people. And we are perhaps even less likely to find a story about God becoming human, dying on a cross, and being resurrected. Indeed, insofar as these stories fail to explain why God would allow evil to exist, they may not even be seen as satisfactory solutions to the problem of evil in the way that it is typically framed. But if it is the case that the gospel narrative, the story of God's victory over sin and evil through Israel's Messiah, gives us insight into the most important solution to the problem of evil, and yet we find this solution unsatisfactory because it fails to address our predominant concerns about the problem, then it seems that we may be approaching the problem of evil in the wrong way. At the very least, it seems likely we might be giving this problem the wrong kind of attention. That is, rather than thinking about the problem of evil according to the story of God's solution to it, we instead become distracted by arrogating to ourselves the task of explaining how God could allow evil to exist in the first place. Whereas the former story is construed according to God's solution, the latter one is defined by a desire to address the problem of evil for ourselves. As Pauline scholar Douglas Campbell writes on this point, when we introduce our account of the problem first and work forwards, rather than introducing the solution first and thinking backwards to the implicit definition of the problem, we tell the wrong story. That is, rather than seeking to interpret the problem of evil according to the narrative of God's solution to it, we seek to tell a story about evil into which we can fit God. By so doing, we turn God into a character in one of our stories, and this is to get things fundamentally the wrong way around. Thank you.